The wrong address. That's all it was supposed to be. Daniel Cole stepped into the funeral home, expecting to say goodbye to an old coworker. Instead, he found himself standing in the doorway of a room full of strangers in black, staring at a closed program with a name he didn't recognize. Margaret Ashford. He almost turned around. He almost walked back out to his car and laughed about it later. Wrong funeral, wrong day. What are the odds? Then he looked at the casket, and his legs stopped working. The woman lying there had his mother's face. Not similar. Not she reminds me of. Exactly her face. Older, softer at the edges, but unmistakably the same woman who used to sing him to sleep 25 years ago, before she disappeared without a trace and never came home. A woman beside him whispered, "Sir, are you all right?" Daniel didn't answer. He was already moving toward the casket, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. One thought burning through his mind like fire. Mom? Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe to Amazing Folktale, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Hype up the video. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what your local time is in the comments below. I love seeing how these stories connect people from all around the world. Let's get started. Daniel Cole was 30 years old, and if you asked anyone who knew him, they'd tell you the same thing. He was the kind of man who showed up. Rain or shine, good day or bad, if you needed him, he was there. He worked as a maintenance supervisor at a mid-sized apartment complex on the edge of the city, the kind of job that didn't pay much but kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. He liked the feeling of walking into a broken apartment and walking out having made it whole. Again. There was something honest about that kind of work. He lived alone in a small rented house with a dog named Biscuit, a mutt he'd found shivering outside a gas station 6 years earlier. His refrigerator was covered in faded photos of a woman with warm brown eyes, holding a little boy who could only be Daniel, maybe 4 or 5 at the time. He never talked about her much, talking about her hurt in a way words couldn't fix, the way a splinter you can't quite reach still aches under the skin. His mother, Elena Cole, had vanished when he was 5 years old. One evening she was there, tucking him into bed, promising she'd be back in a few days after sorting some things out with his father. The next morning, she was simply gone. No note, no warning, no goodbye. For years, Daniel believed the story everyone told him, that his mother had abandoned them, that she'd run off with someone else, that some women just weren't built for motherhood. He believed it because he was a child, and children believe what adults tell them, especially when the adults telling them are the only family they have left. But somewhere deep inside, in a place he never spoke about out loud, Daniel never fully believed it. His mother used to hold him like the world could end and she still wouldn't let go. Women like that didn't just leave. He grew up fast. His father, Walter Cole, was a hard man who worked long hours and drank through the silence Elena left behind. Daniel learned early to take care of himself, cooking his own meals by age 9, walking himself to school because there was no one else to do it. Despite all of it, Daniel never became bitter. He carried his mother's absence like a quiet ache instead of a weapon. He tipped generously, even when he couldn't afford to. He fixed his elderly neighbor's fence for free last spring and refused to take a dime for it. People trusted Daniel because Daniel had never once given them a reason not to. That Tuesday morning, dressed in the only black suit he owned, Daniel had planned to attend the funeral of Marcus Webb, an old coworker who'd once loaned him bus fare when he was 19 and never asked for it back. He checked the address on his phone twice before pulling into the funeral home parking lot. Riverside Chapel, 214 Magnolia Avenue. It matched. He walked in 15 minutes early, the way he always did, out of respect. He had no idea that in less than 10 minutes, his entire understanding of his life, his mother, his father, his own history, was about to shatter into pieces he would spend the rest of the year trying to put back together. He simply walked into the wrong room, and the wrong room held the truth he'd been denied for 25 years. To understand what happened to Elena Cole, you have to go back 25 years, to a small house on the outskirts of the city, where a young mother sang lullabies to her only son every single night, no matter how tired she was. Elena was 26 when Daniel was born, and from the moment she held him, something in her changed. Friends described a woman who lit up entire rooms, funny, warm, endlessly patient. She worked part-time at a flower shop and spent every spare cent on second-hand books for Daniel, determined that her son would grow up loving stories the way she did. Her marriage to Walter, though, was a different story. What began as young love slowly curdled into something colder. Walter's temper grew sharper with every passed-over promotion, every unpaid bill. He never hit Elena, not that anyone ever proved, but neighbors would later recall raised voices, through thin walls, and a young woman who seemed to be shrinking a little more each year. Still, Elena stayed, not because she was weak, but because she believed, the way so many young mothers do, that love and patience could fix almost anything. She used to tell her sister, Ruth, "I don't care what happens to me. That boy is going to know he was loved." Every single day. The week before she disappeared, something shifted. Neighbors remembered Elena, seeming anxious, glancing over her shoulder in a way she never had before. She told her sister Ruth, in a phone call that would later become one of the only real pieces of evidence in the case, that she was figuring some things out and might need to stay somewhere else for a little while. Ruth asked her what was wrong. Elena's answer was strange, almost frightened. "If anything happens to me, promise you'll make sure Danny knows I never left him." "Not really. Not ever." Ruth laughed it off at the time, telling her sister she was being dramatic, that everything would be fine. It was the last real conversation the two sisters ever had. 3 nights later, Elena kissed her sleeping son goodnight, whispered that she loved him more than anything in the world, and told him she'd be back soon. She never came back. The search that followed was short and unsatisfying. Walter told police she'd left him for another man. There were no signs of struggle, nothing that screamed foul play to overworked local police. In Maine, a town without resources for a deeper investigation. Within weeks, the case went cold. Only Ruth never believed it. She spent years trying to convince people, police, family friends, anyone who would listen, that Elena would never have abandoned her son. Nobody listened. Eventually, she learned to carry her doubt quietly. Daniel grew up believing the story everyone else believed. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a 5-year-old boy kept waiting by the window some nights, just in case his mother kept her promise. 25 years later, standing in front of a casket that held a woman named Margaret Ashford, Daniel finally understood. She had kept her promise the whole time. She just never got the chance to come home. The woman who confronted Daniel at the casket introduced herself simply as Victoria. She was composed in the way that only people raised around real money learn to be. Every movement, and controlled. Grief itself arranged neatly on her face like it had been rehearsed. She was maybe 35, dressed in black that probably cost more than Daniel made in 2 months. "Can I help you?" she asked, though her tone made clear she wasn't offering help at all. "That's not Margaret Ashford," Daniel said, his voice shaking. "That's my mother." Victoria's expression flickered, just for a fraction of a second. Something unreadable passed behind her eyes before the composed mask slid back into place. "I'm sorry, you must be confused. This is a private service. Look at her wrist," Daniel said, pointing with a trembling hand toward the small scar visible, just below the sleeve of the burial dress. "That scar. She got it when she was 12, from a kitchen accident. I know every detail of that story, because she told it to me 100 times. For the briefest moment, Victoria's composure cracked. Her eyes darted to the scar, then back to Daniel, calculating something Daniel couldn't yet understand. "You need to leave," she said, her voice suddenly sharper. "Now, before I call security." "I have every right to know who this woman is," Daniel said, refusing to move. "You have no rights here at all," Victoria snapped. And there it was, the first true glimpse of who she really was beneath the polished exterior. Not grieving, not confused, guarding something. 2 security guards appeared within moments, flanking Daniel on either side. Victoria didn't even wait to watch him escorted out. She turned back toward the casket, her back rigid, her jaw tight, already speaking in hushed tones to a well-dressed older man standing near the front, a man Daniel would later learn was named Richard Ashford, Margaret's husband. Billionaire real estate developer. A man whose name appeared on half the skyline of the city. As Daniel was led toward the door, he caught one final detail that would haunt him for days. The way Victoria glanced back at him, not with anger, but with something closer to fear. As if she knew, deep down, that whatever door Daniel had just tried to open could never be fully closed again. Outside, standing in the parking lot, with his heart still racing, Daniel didn't understand yet who Victoria really was to Richard Ashford, or how deep the lies ran. All he knew was that a woman who looked exactly like his missing mother had just been buried under a stranger's name, and someone very powerful clearly did not want that fact questioned. Through the chapel's glass doors, he watched Victoria whisper urgently to Richard, Watched the old man's hand tighten around a chair as if he needed it to stay standing. Whatever secret this family was protecting, Daniel had just cracked its foundation. And foundations, once cracked, tend to collapse. Daniel didn't go home that night. He sat in his car outside the funeral home for almost 2 hours, staring at the building, trying to convince himself he'd imagined the whole thing. He hadn't. 3 days before this, a detail that would later feel unbearably cruel in hindsight, Daniel had ignored a call from an unknown number. The voicemail mentioned something about a woman found at the lake house and asked him to call regarding an urgent family matter. At the time, he'd assumed it was a scam and deleted it without a second thought. Now, sitting in his car outside the funeral home, he pulled up his call log and stared at that missed number until his vision blurred. He drove straight to his father's apartment that night, banging on the door until Walter, 61 now and heavier than Daniel remembered, opened it in a stained undershirt, clearly annoyed at being disturbed. "I saw Mom today," Daniel said, before Walter could even ask what was wrong. Walter's face cycled through confusion, then something like panic, before settling into forced disbelief. "Your mother's gone, Daniel. She left 25 years ago. You know this. I saw her, Dad. In a casket. Buried under the name Margaret Ashford." The color drained from Walter's face so fast that for a moment Daniel thought his father might collapse right there in the doorway. "That's impossible," Walter said, but his voice cracked in a way that told Daniel it wasn't impossible at all. "Then why do you look like you've seen a ghost?" Walter didn't answer. He stood frozen in the doorway, one hand gripping the frame like it was the only thing keeping him upright, and for the first time in Daniel's entire adult life, he watched his father's eyes fill with tears. "I need answers," Daniel said, his own voice breaking now. "I need to know what happened to her, and I think you know more than you've ever told me." "You don't understand," Walter finally whispered. "There are things I did that I'm not proud of. But I swear to you, I never knew she was still alive. I swear it." "What things?" Daniel demanded. "What did you do?" Walter's jaw tightened, decades of guilt visibly warring with decades of silence. "Not tonight," he said finally, closing his eyes. "I can't do this tonight. But I promise you, Daniel, I'll tell you everything. Just give me a little time." Daniel left his father's apartment that night, more shaken than when he'd arrived. For the first time, he understood something with terrible clarity. The story he'd been told his entire life, that his mother simply walked away, had never been the truth. Someone had built an elaborate lie around her disappearance, and his own father had known more than he'd ever admitted. The question now wasn't just what happened to his mother. It was who else had been lying to him his whole life, and why. The next morning, Daniel called the funeral home directly, requesting a copy of Margaret Ashford's death certificate. He was polite, careful not to raise alarm. It didn't matter. Within the hour, he received a call back, not from a funeral director, but from a lawyer representing the Ashford family, warning him in cold, clipped tones that any further harassment of the family would result in legal action. Daniel hadn't even mentioned his suspicions about his mother's identity. Somehow, they already knew exactly who he was and exactly what he wanted. That evening, Daniel drove back to the funeral home, hoping to speak with someone who might give him honest answers. He was met at the door by security and walked back to his car in full view of arriving guests for another service, whispers following him the entire way. He wasn't imagining the shame of it. It burned through him the entire drive home. But just as he was pulling out of the parking lot, a nervous funeral employee named Kevin jogged up to Daniel's car window, glancing repeatedly over his shoulder as if terrified of being seen. "You need to talk to Richard Ashford," Kevin whispered quickly. "The husband. He's the one who signed off on everything about her records. Nobody here knows the real story, but he does." "Why are you telling me this?" Daniel asked. Kevin hesitated, his eyes darting nervously toward the building behind him. "Because that woman, she used to look at old photographs sometimes, when she thought no one was watching. Baby photos. She never had kids with Mr. Ashford. I always wondered whose babies those were." Before Daniel could ask another question, Kevin turned and hurried back inside, disappearing through the side door as quickly as he'd appeared. That single sentence lodged itself into Daniel's chest like a blade. Baby photos. She never had kids with Mr. Ashford. He drove home in stunned silence. If Margaret Ashford truly was his mother, and she'd held and spent decades hiding photographs of a baby that wasn't Richard's, she had never stopped thinking about him. That night, unable to sleep, Daniel began researching Richard Ashford online. Richard was a self-made real estate billionaire whose name appeared in glossy profiles, celebrating his rise to owning half the luxury developments in the city. Margaret appeared beside him in nearly every photo from the last 15 years. Elegant, quiet, always slightly behind him. But before 15 years ago, nothing. No wedding announcements, no maiden name, no family background anywhere Daniel could find. Margaret Ashford's entire existence, according to public record, seemed to begin exactly 15 years earlier, as if she had simply materialized into Richard's Xtay's world out of thin air. For a woman married to one of the most photographed men in the city, Margaret Ashford was, in every meaningful sense, a ghost. And ghosts, Daniel was beginning to understand, don't just appear. They're made. Determined to find answers, Daniel spent the next several nights digging through old newspaper archives and charity event photographs. Eventually, buried in a decades-old society page from a hospital gala, he found what he was looking for: a photograph. Margaret Ashford, 22 years ago, standing beside a much younger Richard, at what appeared to be her introduction into his social circle. She looked achingly like the woman in Daniel's childhood photographs. Same face, the same delicate features, but her eyes told a completely different story. Hollow, frightened, like someone standing perfectly still while silently screaming. He made a decision that night that would change everything. He withdrew nearly all his savings, money he'd been putting aside for years, hoping one day to buy a small house, and hired a private investigator named Marcus Doyle, a retired detective known for handling cases too sensitive or too cold for regular police work. "I need you to find out everything about a woman named Margaret Ashford," Daniel told him, laying every piece of evidence he had across the table: the photographs, the newspaper clipping, dates, names. "I think she's my mother. I think someone erased her identity 25 years ago and replaced it with a lie." Doyle studied the materials for a long moment before looking up at Daniel with the kind of serious expression that told Daniel this wasn't going to be a simple case. "If you're right about this," Doyle said slowly, "we're not just looking at a missing persons case anymore. We're looking at something a lot bigger. And a lot more dangerous." Within a week, Doyle uncovered the first significant piece of the puzzle. Margaret Ashford's a legal identity had been created exactly 22 years ago, not 15, as the magazines suggested, meaning her paperwork existed for 7 years before she ever appeared in a public will. Photograph beside Richard. More troubling still, Elena Cole had vanished exactly 25 years ago. That left a missing gap of 3 years, unaccounted for, between the night Elena disappeared and the moment Margaret Ashford legally came into existence. Where had she been? What had happened to her? Who had the power and the motive to erase a woman's identity and quietly build her a new one? Daniel brought this to his Aunt Ruth. Sitting in her small kitchen, watching her hands tremble, Ruth finally admitted what she'd carried silently for 25 years. "I never believed she left you," Ruth said, tears filling her eyes. "Not once. Your mother loved you more than her own life. I always felt like something happened to her. I just never had proof. Nobody would listen to me." She paused, staring down at her hands. "There was a black car," she added quietly, "parked outside your parents' house, the week before she disappeared. I saw it twice. I never got a good look at the driver. I told the police about it back then. They said it probably meant nothing." Daniel felt something cold settle in his chest. It hadn't meant nothing. It had meant everything. The investigation took a sharp, painful turn when Doyle uncovered a financial record Daniel never wanted to find. 3 weeks after Elena's disappearance, nearly $200,000 had been deposited into an account belonging to Walter Cole, split across several smaller deposits to avoid drawing attention, but unmistakable once Doyle laid it out. Daniel confronted his father with the bank records spread across the kitchen table between them, his hands shaking with a mixture of grief and fury he'd never felt before. "You took money," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper, "right after she disappeared. $200,000. Who paid you, Dad? And for what?" Walter's face crumbled. For a long moment he said nothing at all, staring down at the table like a man finally facing a truth he'd outspent 25 years running from. "A lawyer came to see me," Walter finally admitted, his voice thick with shame. "About a week after Elena left. He told me she'd found someone else, someone wealthy, and that this man wanted to make sure I never came looking for her. He said if I signed papers agreeing to leave it alone, there'd be money. And you just took it. Daniel's voice cracked. You sold her? You sold us? I believed her, Walter said desperately, tears streaming down his weathered face. I told myself I was doing what was best for you, taking care of you with that money, instead of chasing a woman who clearly didn't want to be found. I swear, I never once imagined she might have been taken. Daniel sat in stunned silence, grief and rage colliding somewhere deep in his chest. His father hadn't simply failed to protect his mother, he had been paid to stop looking for her. Whoever orchestrated Elena's disappearance had been powerful enough and wealthy enough to quietly buy Walter's silence and make an entire family's and its tragedy disappear beneath a lie everyone was willing to believe. But one question remained unanswered, burning brighter than all the others. If Elena hadn't left willingly, if she'd been taken, silenced, erased and rebuilt into Margaret Ashford against her will, what had those 3 missing years actually held? And more terrifying still, had she spent the last 22 years as Richard Ashford's wife, or his prisoner? The deeper Doyle dug, the darker the truth became. Working through old medical records obtained through a contact at a private psychiatric store facility 2 states away, Doyle discovered that a woman matching Margaret Ashford's description had been quietly admitted nearly 22 years earlier. Around the exact time, her legal identity was created. The official diagnosis was vague: memory issues, disorientation, but the language, Doyle said, was disturbingly familiar, the kind used to describe someone sedated for extended periods. Someone whose confusion wasn't organic but manufactured. Doyle managed to track down a retired nurse named Grace Whitfield, who had worked at the facility during that time. Reluctant at first, Grace eventually agreed to speak with Daniel directly, moved by the desperation in his voice over the phone. I remember her, Grace said quietly, sitting across from Daniel at a small diner outside the city. She was quiet, but not confused the way the paperwork claimed. Sometimes, when the sedatives were wearing thin, she'd cry out a name in her sleep. What name? Daniel asked, though some part of him already knew. Grace's eyes softened with sympathy. Danny, she said. She used to cry out Danny, over and over. The staff were told she was delusional, imagining a child that didn't exist. I always thought that was strange. She didn't seem delusional to me. She seemed like a woman grieving something real. Daniel had to excuse himself from the table, stepping outside to keep from breaking down entirely in public. 25 years his mother had been alive, crying out his name in a sedated haze, while everyone around her insisted she was imagining things. Grace revealed one more devastating detail before Daniel left. According to hospital records, Margaret had attempted to leave the facility twice, both times found and returned within days by unknown associates connected to Richard Ashford. Not a patient seeking treatment, a woman being kept. Daniel returned home that night hollowed out. Every year he'd spent believing she'd abandoned him, every birthday he'd quietly wondered if she ever thought of him. All of it had been built on a lie, orchestrated by people wealthy enough to purchase silence. Whatever the full truth was, Daniel now understood one thing with absolute certainty. His mother hadn't left him. She had been stolen from him, and someone was going to answer for it. With Doyle's help, Daniel began assembling everything into something resembling a complete picture, though several critical pieces were still missing. Doyle obtained recorded testimony from a former household employee of the Ashford estate, who had quietly resigned under mysterious circumstances. Speaking anonymously, she confirmed what Grace had already suggested. Margaret Ashford had never behaved like a willing wife. She rarely left the estate unaccompanied. Her mail was screened. Her phone calls were monitored. She wasn't a wife, the former employee said quietly, her voice barely audible in the recording Doyle later played for Daniel. She was watched, every single day, like they were afraid she'd disappear if they blinked. The most unexpected discovery came from Victoria herself. Public records revealed she wasn't Richard's wife, as Daniel had assumed at the funeral. She was his daughter, from an earlier marriage that ended nearly 30 years ago. She had grown up under Richard's roof beside a woman she'd been told was her stepmother, the woman she'd known her entire adult life as Margaret Ashford. Victoria hadn't been protecting a husband's mistress. She had been protecting her father's carefully constructed empire, built in part on the silence of a stolen woman she genuinely believed had chosen to be there. Armed with mounting evidence, falsified identity records, psychiatric documentation, testimony, and financial records tying Walter's silence to Richard's lawyers, Daniel and Doyle prepared for the confrontation that could no longer be avoided. But before that could happen, one final, devastating discovery awaited. A hidden journal, kept secretly for over 2 decades in a locked drawer of what had once been Margaret's private reading room, quietly retrieved by Kevin, the nervous funeral employee who'd first pointed Daniel toward the truth. Kevin handed the leather-bound journal to Daniel with trembling hands outside a quiet coffee shop. She asked me once, years ago, if anything ever happened to her, would I make sure this got to her family, Kevin said. I didn't understand what she meant then. I think I do now. On the very first page, in handwriting, Daniel instantly recognized from faded birthday cards, tucked away in an old shoebox at home, were 4 words that broke something open in his chest, that he would never be able to fully close again. For Danny, if I never make it back. Daniel read the journal alone that night, unable to stop even as tears blurred the words on nearly every page. It began the night Elena disappeared. She wrote about being confronted outside a small grocery store by a man she didn't recognize, offering her money on behalf of a wealthy stranger who had seen her once and become obsessed with her resemblance to a woman he'd loved and lost years earlier. When she refused and tried to walk away, she was forced into a car. She wrote about the 3 years that followed, isolated in a secluded property, told repeatedly that her husband had been paid off and her son had already been told she'd abandoned him. She wrote about believing, for a long time, that resistance was pointless, that no one was coming for her. She wrote about the moment Margaret Ashford was born, a new identity constructed for her, complete with a fabricated background, forced upon her not as a choice but as a cage, disguised as a new life. She wrote about the sedatives used to keep her compliant during the early years, about her 2 failed escape attempts, about the crushing despair of being found and returned each time, watched more closely afterward than before. And she wrote about Daniel, page after page, year after year, entries scattered across 2 decades, always circling back to the son she'd been stolen from. He'll be starting school soon, one early entry read. I wonder if he still likes the color blue. I wonder if he remembers my voice at all. He'd be 18 now, read a later entry. I hope someone told him I loved him. I hope somebody, somewhere, told him the truth. The final entry, dated only months before her death, broke Daniel completely. I don't know if I'll ever see him again. I don't know if this journal will ever find its way to him. But if it does, Danny, I need you to know that not one single day passed where I stopped loving you. Not one. They took everything else from me. They never took that. Daniel sat on his living room floor for hours after finishing the journal, Biscuit curled quietly beside him, the weight of 25 years of stolen truth finally settling over him completely. His mother hadn't abandoned him. She had fought for him, silently, desperately, for 22 years, and from inside a prison built of wealth and lies and forced silence. And now Daniel understood exactly what he needed to do. The confrontation happened 3 weeks later, at a large charity gala hosted at Richard Ashford's estate, the kind of event filled with press cameras, city officials, and the full glittering weight of Richard's carefully built reputation. Daniel wasn't invited. He didn't need to be. He arrived with Doyle at his side, a copy of the journal in hand, and walked directly through the front entrance before security could stop him, moving with a calm, unshakable purpose that made even the guards hesitate. Everyone needs to hear this, Daniel said loudly, his voice cutting cleanly through the crowded ballroom, as heads turned and conversations died around him. My name is Daniel Cole. 25 years ago, my mother, Elena Cole, was kidnapped, drugged, and forced into a new identity by this man. He pointed directly at Richard, who stood frozen near the center of the room, champagne glass slipping slightly in his grip. You knew her as Margaret Ashford. I knew her as Mom. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Camera flashes began erupting from every direction as reporters realized, in real time, that they were witnessing something far bigger than a routine charity event. This is absurd, Richard finally managed, his voice tight with controlled panic. This young man is clearly disturbed, grieving, confused. Am I? Daniel interrupted, holding up the journal for the room to see. Because I have my mother's own handwriting describing exactly what you did to her. I have hospital records showing she was sedated against her will. I have testimony from staff who watched her be monitored like a prisoner for over 20 years. And I have bank records proving you paid my father to stay silent. Victoria stepped forward from near the edge of the crowd, her face pale, her earlier composure completely shattered. "Dad," she said quietly, her voice trembling, "is this true?" Richard's silence answered the question more completely than any words could have. "I was lied to my whole life too," Victoria said, turning to face the stunned crowd, tears now openly streaming down her face. "I believed she chose this. I believed she was happy. I sensed something was wrong for years, and I was too afraid, too dependent, too comfortable to ever really ask. I am so sorry." Richard, finally cornered with nowhere left to hide, made one final, desperate attempt at control. "Whatever you think you know," he said, turning back to Daniel, his voice low and threatening. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Daniel said, stepping closer, his voice steady, despite the storm of emotion behind it. "A man who stole a mother from her son for 22 years, because he was wealthy enough to think he could simply buy silence and rewrite the truth. But truth doesn't stay buried forever." He held the journal higher, his mother's handwriting visible to every phone camera now recording the scene. "This is her voice," Daniel said, his own voice finally breaking. "After 25 years of silence, you're finally going to hear it." The fallout was swift and absolute. Within 24 hours, footage of the confrontation had spread across every major news outlet in the country. Journalists who had spent years profiling Richard as a self-made success story scrambled to uncover the truth behind Margaret Ashford, and the story that emerged was even darker than Daniel had first imagined. Investigators, acting on the journal, medical records, and testimony Doyle had compiled, opened a formal investigation into Elena's disappearance, her forced identity change, and the suspicious circumstances surrounding her death. Richard's longtime private physician eventually confirmed under questioning that he'd been pressured for years to falsify Margaret's medical records, suppressing concerns about her declining health in the months before she died. Richard Ashford was arrested within the week, facing charges connected to unlawful confinement, falsification of records, and potential involvement in Elena's death. His business empire began collapsing almost overnight. Longtime partners severed ties. Major developments stalled as investors pulled funding. Accounts were frozen. The man whose name once graced half the skyline of the city became, within days, a symbol of exactly the kind of cruelty wealth can conceal. Victoria, to the surprise of many watching the story unfold, didn't disappear into hiding or hire lawyers to distance herself from the scandal. Instead, she publicly cooperated with investigators, providing everything she knew, however painful it was to confront the truth about the father she'd spent her life admiring. She reached out to Daniel personally, not asking for forgiveness, but simply offering what truth she had left to give. "I can't undo what happened to your mother," she told him during their only face-to-face meeting after the scandal broke, her voice thick with genuine remorse. "But I can make sure the world knows exactly who she really was. Not Margaret Ashford, Elena Cole, a mother who never stopped fighting to get back to her son." Walter, too, faced consequences of his own, not legal ones, but consequences far harder to escape. The truth of the silence he'd sold became public knowledge alongside everything else. He lost the respect of what little family and community he had left. When Daniel visited him weeks later, he found a broken man, finally facing the full weight of a choice he could never take back. "I know I don't deserve it," Walter said quietly, unable to meet his son's eyes. "But I am sorry, Daniel. More sorry than I know how to say." Daniel didn't offer easy forgiveness that day, but he didn't walk away from his father completely either. Some wounds, he was learning, don't heal through grand gestures. They heal slowly, through small, honest steps taken over time. Justice, in the end, hadn't arrived through violence or revenge. It had arrived through truth, patient, painful, and impossible, in the end, to keep buried forever. 3 months later, Daniel stood beneath a quiet oak tree in a small cemetery, surrounded by a handful of people who mattered most: Aunt Ruth, Doyle, Grace Whitfield, and, standing a respectful distance away, Victoria. The gravestone in front of him no longer read, "Margaret Ashford." It read, simply and finally, "Elena Cole, beloved mother, never stopped loving." Daniel had insisted on a real funeral, a real goodbye, one built on truth instead of lies. It was small, quiet, nothing like the grand, glittering service that had first led him through the wrong door months earlier. But it was honest. And after 25 years, honest was everything Daniel had ever really wanted. He held the worn leather journal in his hands. Its pages softened now from being read and reread more times than he could count. Clearing his throat, he opened it to the final entry, his voice steady despite the tears already gathering in his eyes. I don't know if I'll ever see him again, Daniel read aloud, his mother's words finally spoken into the open air after decades of silence. I don't know if this journal will ever find its way to him, but if it does, Danny, I need you to know that not one single day passed where I stopped loving you. Not one. They took everything else from me. They never took that. He closed the journal gently, pressing it against his chest for a long moment before kneeling down to lay a single blue flower, her favorite color, the one detail he'd never forgotten, against the base of the headstone. I know now, Mom, he whispered. I know you never left me. I'm sorry it took so long to find you. But I found you. And I'm not going to let the world forget who you really were, ever again. Behind him, Ruth wiped tears from her eyes, finally able to release 25 years of guilt she'd carried for not being believed sooner. Victoria stood quietly at the edge of the gathering, no longer an enemy, no longer even a stranger, but something more complicated, a woman learning, slowly, how to build an honest life out of the wreckage of one built on lies. As the small group began to disperse, Daniel lingered a moment longer beside the grave, the late afternoon sun casting long, gentle shadows across the quiet cemetery grounds. He thought about the wrong turn that had led him there months earlier, the mixed-up address, the funeral he was never supposed to attend. What once felt like the cruelest coincidence of his life now felt like something else entirely. Not an accident. A door, finally, after 25 long years, swinging open. He had walked into the wrong funeral. But he had found the right truth. And for the first time in 25 years, Daniel Cole finally understood what it felt like to bring his mother home.
Moral of the story: truth doesn't disappear just because someone with money and power decides to bury it. For 25 years, a lie was maintained through silence, fear, and financial control. And for 25 years it held. But it only took one honest man, refusing to look away for the whole structure to collapse. That's the real lesson here. Wealth can rewrite a name, forge a history, and silence witnesses, but it can never fully erase love. Elena never stopped being a mother, even trapped behind someone else's fabricated identity. Her love for Daniel outlived every lie built to bury it. This story is also a reminder that we are responsible for the silences we keep, not just the lies we tell. Walter didn't kidnap Elena, but his decision to accept money and stop asking questions cost his son 25 years with his mother. Comfort bought with someone else's suffering is never really comfort. It's a debt that eventually comes due. And finally, integrity has a cost, but it's always smaller than the cost of staying silent. Daniel could have taken the payout. He chose truth instead, and truth